And so, to start, we are sitting in a relaxed and yet upright and alert posture. If we have not already taken them, then 3 deep cleansing breaths are an excellent way to begin. Drawing the air deeply down into our abdomen and then slowly filling our entire body, raising the diaphragm and finally the chest. And then as we let go, letting go completely. Not just letting go of the breath, but letting go of all expectations, all worries, distractions, everything. So here we have reached the 4th of the 6 sessions on this module, the wisdom of emptiness. So it is very good for us to remind ourselves of why we might be interested in studying such a subject as the wisdom of emptiness. Why was it taught by the Buddha to begin with? And why is it that we have interest in it? If we approach it with the attitude that this is an esoteric subject, something that a lot of people don't know very much about, and that if we were to study it and become familiar with some of its terminology, this would be a feather in our cap, something that we could add to our resume, a way of enhancing our reputation. If this is all that the study or practice of the meditation on emptiness, the cultivation of the wisdom of emptiness, if this is all that it means to us, then we are turning medicine into poison. For it is the wisdom of emptiness that frees us from our self-created prisons, specifically the prison of the self. And so if we use the teachings and the meditations on emptiness simply to enhance our petty ego identity, we're turning everything upside down. So instead we should remind ourselves that the whole purpose for teaching and receiving the teachings on the wisdom of emptiness is to gain freedom. From all the unwanted experiences of our life. Everything from general vague restlessness to outright agony of body, of mind, of spirit. All of them have their root in the very same ignorance that the wisdom of emptiness is designed to overcome. But it is not enough to free ourselves from this ignorantly created prison. All around us, in whatever direction we look, are countless millions of other beings still trapped in this ignorance and still living lives of desperation, frustration, exhaustion, wanting to be free, wanting to experience happiness and well-being, aching to experience fulfillment, and yet, in fact, experiencing disappointment after disappointment. So we should remind ourselves that we are not alone, and cultivate as altruistic and as expansive a motivation as we can for participating in these teachings, to study this subject matter, to free not only ourselves, but to help free others who, just like ourselves, do not desire even the slightest bit of suffering and disappointment, and want only peace, well-being, happiness, and finally, full spiritual fulfillment. Considering thoughts such as these, let us cultivate this expansive, compassionate motivation for this session today. Okay. By the way, today is the 4th session, isn't it? Or is it the 5th? The 4th. Good. I went to a Giants game in SBC Park yesterday with my son. The first time I had been there. I had been to a few games in the old Candlestick Park years and years ago, but I hadn't been to the new one. And this inability to remember exactly which session this was reminded me of something that I heard about Willie Mays when he was a young ball player, when he was part of the New York Giants, before its reincarnation as the San Francisco Giants. And people were amazed by the say, hey kid, because he could do everything. He could bat for average, he could bat for power, he could throw, he could run. He was incredible on the base paths, and his fielding was unbelievable, right? So there was this one situation in which it was 2 outs and there were 2 men on base, and he of course was playing deep center field, and the ball was hit out to him, and he ran out and made this absolutely incredible catch, and then he spun around and fired the ball into second base to double up the runner. But actually it was unnecessary because there had been 2 outs, so the out that he made was the 3rd out. There was no need to throw the ball back in to double up the runner to get the final out. He'd already gotten it. So the manager of the other team said, at last we found a weakness in Willie Mays. He can't count. So we're continuing on this this slow, step-by-step introduction into this subject matter, the wisdom of emptiness. And at this point, it would be good to talk about the factors that enable us to gain deeper and deeper understanding of this subject, because it is difficult. Emptiness is a difficult subject, and it isn't just simply that the concepts are hard to grasp. It goes much beyond that, because in fact the concepts themselves aren't that hard. It's that it's difficult to apply. It's difficult to apply because our vision of things is so mixed with an incorrect view that it's very hard to separate out what really exists and what's only a projection, a false projection of ignorance. It's a little bit, an example that we can use is, I don't know what a fish actually thinks, but it's occurred to me that fish may not recognize the existence of water. It's possible, because they're living in it, right? So unless they're a flying fish or a fish that's been caught and is, going to die soon, they don't know anything other than living in a world of water. So maybe they don't have a concept of what water is. It's just their natural surrounding. They're so familiar with it as the only way things are that there's no objective distance from it. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe that's not at all what fish are thinking. Maybe that's what I would think if I were a fish. Okay? But anyway, be that as it may, something somewhat similar to that may be at work here, is that we're so accustomed to our view being contaminated that it's hard to spot the contamination. It just seems natural. Right? And we will have more to say about that as this session goes on. But that seems to be one of the biggest problems, to recognize what the wisdom of emptiness is fighting against, what it's trying to uproot. Okay. So there are, it says in the teachings, I should say, that there are 3 activities, perhaps we can call them, that enable us to promote this development of wisdom. And I should say here that in a few minutes, I think, we'll be getting handouts that's going to have these 3 written on them already, and some of the other things, like everything that was written on the papers that were on the board last time, they'll be on there as well. So certainly people are encouraged, if they have interest, to take notes, but just to let you know that that material will be passed out soon. Okay? So these 3 activities that promote the development of wisdom, what are they? Well, according to this list, the first one is engaging in the collecting and cleansing practices. Engaging in the collecting and cleansing practices. And those of you who attended earlier modules might remember what this phrase collecting and cleansing refers to. Is anyone brave enough to offer? Yes, please, sir.
Merit and purifying?
Yeah. Sarah said collecting merit and purifying. Okay, here the image that we can keep in mind is, and many people here have heard this already, but it's a very helpful image. It's the image of a farmer trying to grow crops in a field. And it's not enough just to throw out seeds and hope, that a crop will automatically arise. The field has to be prepared, right? So things that would interfere with the germination and the growth of these seeds like weeds, rocks, tree stumps, and so forth. They have to be removed from the field to begin with. Okay? And that itself is not enough. The nutritional level, the nutrient level of the soil has to be enhanced. And farmers may use fertilizer. They certainly want to make sure that the field gets enough water, enough sunlight, and so forth. So there's two practices to prepare the field so that the seeds will germinate, sprout, grow, and develop properly. Okay? One is to cleanse. Remove from the field everything that might interfere with the growth of the crop. And the other is collect. Collect all the required elements to strengthen the field, strengthen its growing ability. Okay, so fertilizer, water, sunshine, and so forth. Cleansing and collecting. Well, very, very similar considerations are there in terms of our own mind. The desire, we're not, we don't want to grow potatoes. That's not the crop we're looking for. When I was a kid, my mom used to clean out my ears, with a wet, what do you call those things? No, yeah, washcloth, small washcloth, she'd kind of go in there. And then she'd come out and she'd say, "Oh, looks like you're growing potatoes." So the idea is not to grow potatoes. We're trying to develop a realization of the wisdom of emptiness. We're trying to gain an understanding of something that we don't currently have an understanding of. If I can speak for all of us, that might be presumptuous. Okay, an understanding which I currently don't have, and perhaps some other people in the room as well. Okay, so we're trying to develop a new understanding. But the mind, the field of our mind, is clogged. There's a lot of things going on in our mind which prevent us from gaining that insight, from interfering with it. So those things have to be cleansed from the field of the mind. And also, the very strength of the mind itself has to be increased. In other words, we have to collect those things which will give that kind of strength to the mind so that the realization can develop. So those practices that cleanse impurities from the field of the mind and then collect the desired qualities, the strength is the way I've been abbreviating that, those cleansing and collecting practices are important to engage in if we want to cultivate any realization, but especially the realization of emptiness because of the difficulty that exists in gaining such a realization. So there are many different collecting and cleansing practices. But many of the key elements are combined in what's known as the seven-limb prayer. The seven-limb prayer. How many people have heard about the seven-limb prayer before, or the seven limbs of practice? How many people have heard? How many people have not heard? That's kind of a new thing. Okay, it's about. So those of you've heard, tell those who haven't heard. No, sorry, I'm just joking. Okay, so what I'll do now, this is a whole subject matter unto itself. But what I'm going to do now is just a very, very brief survey. And as I said, in the papers that will be handed out, these are, oh, they're there. Okay, maybe, Venerable Somalai, would you mind passing them out now? Yeah. Often I wait until a break time because I sometimes think that the papers are interference, but I think in this case it might be helpful to have it. So as they're being passed out, you'll see that letter A are the three activities that promote the development of wisdom. And the first of those three is engaging in the collecting and cleansing practices. And B is just a list of those collecting and cleansing practices that form the seven-limb prayer or the seven limb practice. Okay? I think almost everyone has it now? Okay. That's quite a different kind of emptiness, though. Okay, we're pretty much there. Okay, so we're in capital letter B, the seven limb practice of collecting and cleansing. All right? So there's the seven. The first is called homage, or sometimes prostration. And prostration or homage is of many varieties. Often we think of prostration, we think of the physical act of pressing our hands together and touching various places on our body, and then putting our body down in a half or a full prostration on the ground, and then standing up. But that's only one type of prostration. There's even among physical prostrations, that's only one type. For instance, even simply pressing your hands together and slightly bowing your head in a gesture of respect is prostration. It's adopting an attitude of homage, that in front of us, either represented on the altar or in as the focus of our attention, in front of us is an object worthy of respect. In this case, the source of these teachings, and the teachings themselves, and the community of those who dedicate themselves to developing insights into these teachings. The Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Okay, the teacher, the teachings, and the community. So when we develop respect, we show respect for that, we're showing respect for these outer signs, these outer sources of the teachings, in the hopes that we will develop the same qualities within ourselves. Okay. So prostrations can be done by physical gestures. Prostrations can also be verbal. In other words, the reciting of prayers or reciting of praises. That's like a verbal prostration. And then ultimately, and this is true in nearly everything, and perhaps maybe there's no exception to this, the ultimate prostration is mental. It's the attitude of respect itself. Okay? Without that attitude of respect, one could do 100,000 full-length physical prostrations, and that would just be bodily exercise. That wouldn't be paying homage. Okay? So, this is a very powerful practice of both collecting and cleansing. Yeah.
But there's a spider circling around your shirt, and I'm thinking it'll be more of a distraction for the class if it goes inside you and you have to remove it than if somebody gets it now.
Where's it now?
Maybe one of you guys.
He's not on the back anymore. I did see him go there.
He went sort of in and then he changed his mind.
He's probably inside your collar.
That's probably a good decision on its part. I didn't take a shower today. Well, if you guys see it again, let me know. So, no, please. So, prostration or homage is both a collecting and a cleansing practice. Cleansing in the sense that there are, among the obstacles that we have to developing realizations, one of the most dangerous is an attitude of arrogance. You know, I know it already. You have nothing to tell me. So there's a kind of a puffed up and ultimately baseless arrogance or pride. Not pride in the good sense, pride in the obnoxious sense. All right? And so physically, verbally, and mentally, placing oneself in a posture that is below that of the object that we're paying homage to is a way of countering that arrogance. Indicating that there is something for us to learn. Okay? So, if we think of that arrogance as an obstacle, which of course it is, then offering the prostration is a cleansing practice to help overcome that false sense of pride, that arrogance. Okay? It's also a collecting practice because the verbal and physical practice itself creates a store of verbal and physical merit or positive energy. So it gives strength to the body, strength to the speech, and ultimately strength to the mind. So there is both a cleansing aspect and a collecting aspect. And there's a lot more that could be said about this, but I do want to keep this part of the discussion brief. Right? So, the next one. Offering. Here, the main obstacle to be overcome is miserliness. Having a tight mind, a mind that's unwilling to give. And so, again, the practice of making offering is a way of cleansing the mind of that kind of obstacle. Mm-hmm. I'll probably have to say this for each one, so I'm going to just say it once more and the rest let it be assumed. There's a lot more that could be said about these practices. But just to get an idea of what is being collected and what's being cleansed by each one, even if it's not complete. Then the third one, the declaration of non-virtue. In some translations, this is called confessing. But that's like the word morality that I talked about last week, having so many kind of puritanical connotations that are inappropriate. Confessing can also have inappropriate connotations because it's used in other traditions and their understanding of it may be similar, it may be different. And it's better to face this with kind of new eyes, without preconceived notions of what it means. And besides, I've been told that the Tibetan word doesn't really mean confessing, it means exposing or declaring. So the declaration of non-virtue. We have, in the past, created activities of body, speech, and mind which were harmful, non-virtuous, right? Productive of suffering for ourselves and others. And many of these we have hidden from ourselves, hidden from others, or hidden in the sense of simply forgotten about. Things that we've done earlier in this life, things we've done in past lives, of course, are hidden to the vast majority of us. Okay? So, simply exposing or declaring the non-virtue that we've created in the past is a doorway to ridding ourselves of the defilement of those actions. So an honest declaration of those actions that we can remember, and even those actions which, while we can't remember, we can assume we must have created because we're living with their consequences. Right? So, for instance, in the Buddhist teachings, having a kind of the kind of appearance which causes other people to get frightened or to cause them to cringe somehow, having that kind of appearance, is said to be, among other things, the result of anger and impatience. So, if we walk into the room and other people go running, screaming out of the room at the mere sight of us, then even though we might not remember those actions done in impatience and anger, we can assume, assuming we have, of course, faith that the teachings of Buddha in this regard are correct, that we had created such actions in the past. And so that's something that we can declare. Now here, declare doesn't mean, publishing it in the Sentinel, or broadcasting it. It means simply being honest with ourselves. And it certainly doesn't mean feeling guilty for what we've done. Feeling guilty in this regard is just tying us to the past. Here, we're aiming towards the future. This is the current situation. How can I improve on it? Okay? The reaction of guilt, as it's commonly understood, it doesn't help. It only hinders our ability to get on with our life. Guilt traps us in the past. And here we're trying to learn from mistakes we've made in the past, so in the future we'll avoid them. Okay? So declaring, just honestly declaring, exposing. The fourth is like the flip side of this, rejoicing in virtue. Because again, many of the things that we've done in the past, even now in the present, and it will be the case in the future, are positive, are virtuous. And it's good to recognize that. Not only that, but there are other people that we share this planet with who engage in virtuous actions. And we can rejoice in their actions, both the virtuous actions of beings who are a lot like ourselves, and the virtuous actions of beings like the great teachers, Buddha, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and so forth, whose level of virtuous positive actions is compared to the ordinary run of activities is very much superior, very much more wide-ranging. Okay? So this is a vastly powerful way of collecting a store of merit, simply rejoicing in the virtues that ourselves and others have performed. A friend of mine, when he lived in India, he knew that between the hours of about roughly like 3 and 8 in the morning, on the hill where he was living, there was all these very high beings engaging in their meditation practices. His Holiness the Dalai Lama wakes up very, very early in the morning, then does his practices before and after breakfast. So, for many hours he's engaged in those practices. And the same was true for his tutors and all these other lamas in Dharamsala and up in the hills behind it. So in the morning, when my friend would wake up, he would just rejoice in what was happening all around him, because he knew that there was all these extraordinary beings who weren't just doing their practice the way I do my practice, finished. That wasn't the nature of their practice. Judging by the results, their practice is a little bit more sincere and heartfelt than that. Okay, so he just rejoiced in it. He just had pictures of all these of his lamas and all the the great lamas that he knew of on the hill, and he would just say, "I rejoice in what the Dalai Lama is doing. I rejoice in what Lama Zopa is doing. I rejoice in what Ling Rinpoche is doing," like that. And it's great because it's said that by doing that, we get a portion of their merit. So it's easy way of increasing the strength of the mind. And if you're like me, maybe when you first hear a teaching like this, you think, oh, this is just some kind of superstition. How could my rejoicing in the practice of someone else give me a portion of that merit? But the more we think about it, the more actually it becomes extremely reasonable. As we've said many, many times before, this is a mentally conditioned universe that we live in. The kind of mind we have, the kind of attitude that we have, creates the experiences that we're going to have. It's not like the experiences are waiting out there and we're just kind of blindly bumping into them. The way our mind is functioning magnetically draws or creates the conditions for having this kind of experience as opposed to that kind of experience. Well, meritorious energy, or merit, is just that energy which brings about a positive result. Okay? So think that instead of thinking, instead of when you waking up in the morning wondering, oh, I wonder what this fascist government did to that fascist government to kill more people. Instead of that being the consideration, right? Which sets up everything from anger, resentment, jealousy, all these unstable states of mind, which is obviously, in this mentally conditioned universe, going to create suffering, at least for ourselves, just entertaining those kinds of thoughts. We entertain thoughts like, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is definitely meditating on compassion right now. And it's not a blind compassion, it's compassion completely infused with wisdom. So I just rejoice in that. Well, think of the imprint that's making on our mind just to entertain a thought like that, even if we don't know what his practices are. Even if at that moment maybe he's having breakfast and not actively doing that practice. It doesn't matter. Right? Just entertaining those thoughts is creating for us a different universe. That is collection of merit. Okay? And, as I said in the beginning, we not only rejoice in the merit created by these rather extraordinary beings, but we bring to mind the fact that even poor little schlubby me, every once in a while, drags an old lady across the street, against her will. For the Boy Scout merit badges, how many women did you drag across the street? Sorry. The Giants lost last night. I'm suffering. This is really a great teaching, too, in impermanence and change, because I grew up in New Jersey, and my favorite team was the Dodgers, not the Los Angeles Dodgers, the Brooklyn Dodgers. And our hated rivals was the New York Giants, not the San Francisco Giants. And we lived and died with them. And I was only 13 or 14 when both of them left. And it was devastating, For adults it was pretty bad, but for kids, I memorized all the batting averages of Carl Furillo and Roy Campanella and all those guys. I knew all of that. And they were just gone. They just left 3,000 miles away, So, we all recognize, even the Dodger fans, that Willie Mays was something else. But we hated the Giants anyway. We didn't hate Willie. We would have loved to have had him on our team. But we hated the Giants, and we loved the Dodgers, So now, after so then I went into a kind of a limbo. I think I'm never going to give my heart to a team again, because they just leave, And I never did. It kind of like killed that in me. But you come here and you live here and you read the newspapers, and pretty soon you realize that people around here love the Giants and hate the Dodgers. Right? And of course I had no love left for the Dodgers, because after a few years there was no members of that team that were anywhere related to the people who played in Brooklyn. They died out. So there's no connection anymore. And so here I am, a make-believe Giants fan, when the Giants were the hated foe, and hating the Dodgers, who were my first love. Impermanence. There's nothing certain in samsara, and nothing certain in the National League. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, rejoicing. Then the next two are known as requesting and beseeching, and sometimes their orders change. And just as a word, requesting and beseeching, they're kind of synonyms. But what they mean, requesting means asking for the enlightened beings to turn the wheel of Dharma. In other words, requesting teachings. And this is a very powerfully positive action, because among other things, it creates a connection between us and the teachings. If we pretty much get what we desire, not just what we say, but what we deeply desire, You know, if what we deeply desire is warfare, we'll be born in a war zone. You know, what I mean by desiring warfare, if we take pleasure in it, you know, if our mind is completely filled with violence, you know, if we rejoice in the violent actions of others, then what we're doing is we're mentally conditioning our universe so that we'll find ourselves in warfare sooner or later, if not in this life, then in a future lifetime. Okay. So here, if we're requesting that the Buddhas continue to turn the wheel of the Dharma, which is just a phrase which means give the teachings, found and promote the teachings, then we are we're creating a condition where magnetically we'll be drawn to where the teachings are. You know, we'll gravitate towards them. Okay. Then beseeching is asking the gurus, the advanced beings, the Buddhas, to remain with us. You know, not to depart, but to stay in this rather imperfect universe, to teach, to be a living example, to be a guide. And then finally, what sums all of these practices up, and which we do when I remember at the end of each one of our sessions here, is the dedication of merit. So that we draw together all of the meritorious energy that we've generated, even simply by doing this 7-limb practice, and we dedicate it to the highest, most expansive goal, the removal of all beings from their suffering, the continuation of the long life of our teachers, our attainment of enlightenment, and so forth. Okay? So these practices, and ones that are very intimately related to them, are what's known as the collecting and cleansing practices, and they help prepare our mind to gain insights into the teachings. One practice that I didn't mention but supports this very closely, and is a key practice of cleansing, is known as the Vajrasattva purification meditation. Vajrasattva, Vajra is V-A-J-R-A, Vajra, and Sattva is the same word as in Bodhisattva, meaning being, S-A-T-T-V-A. So Vajrasattva is the Vajra being, the diamond-hard being, and in this room, has it been removed or is it just covered? Okay, the large Vajrasattva picture I was going to draw your attention to is, there's a curtain over it at the moment. But there's many forms of Vajrasattva, and this is a very, very powerful meditation for actually doing everything that was just summarized in the 7-limb practice, to expose the faulty actions that we've created in the past, and then develop a sincere sense of regret, but not guilt, for having done that, then countering that negativity by reminding ourselves of our refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and cultivating the precious bodhicitta, and then applying the remedial actions, such as recitation of mantra and so forth, which provide the counterbalance to the negativity that we're purifying. And we needn't think that the positive actions that we take have to be traditional and doctrinal. Because there are, according to the doctrine, according to the scriptures, certain activities which create merit, that counterbalance negative actions. But there's many things not written down in the teachings that create positive actions. We just have the eyes, we need the eyes and the intelligence to see them. So for instance, if we know in our past, or if we have a strong suspicion in our past that we've created strong negativity by being very tight and miserly and not caring for the welfare of others, then a very positive thing that we can do is take care of others. Visit sick people in the hospital, just as one example. In other words, we give of our time, we give of our energy as a way to counterbalance the negative force of being closed-minded or miserly. Okay? And one perfect example comes from the movie Gandhi. I've quoted this before in a previous class, but I think it's been a long time, so maybe you never heard it, or maybe you forgot that I said it. But in the movie Gandhi, most people here have seen it, I'm assuming. Yeah. Then in the movie Gandhi, he's apparently dying because he engaged in this very, very long fast in Calcutta because the Hindus and the Muslims were killing each other. And so he went and he was going to fast even until death, until they stopped fighting with one another. And so in this one scene, in this very weakened state, he's sitting on this bed outside on a kind of a veranda or a roof of a house, and there's all these thousands and thousands of people around. And people are very worried that he's going to die. And out of the crowd comes a Hindu man, and he takes a piece of bread, a chapati, and he kind of thrusts it on Gandhi, and he says, "Here, eat this. I won't have your death on my conscience as well." So Gandhi asks him what he means, and he confesses. He said, "Well, I know I'm going to hell because during the fighting, I killed this boy, this Muslim boy, So I have his death on my consciousness, and now I don't want your death on my consciousness. So here, eat this." You remember that scene? And then Gandhi says to him, he says, "I know a way out of hell." And then he says, what you have to do is you have to go through the city and find a child, a Muslim boy who's been orphaned in this fight, and then raise him as your own. He says, but be sure to raise him as a Muslim. Like that. And I mean, for me, in all the movies I've ever seen, I think that's the most deeply touching moment, because it's true. It's true what he was saying. There is a way out of our hell, and it is to recognize those things that we've done under the force of ignorance and the delusions, and then to not so much to feel guilty about it, like, oh, I'm such a terrible person, I'm definitely, I've done something which I can't possibly remove, but just honestly regretting it. That was definitely a negative, harmful action. And then take steps to rectify it by acting differently, speaking differently, and ultimately thinking differently. Okay. So if you look up in the scriptures, you don't see as a remedial action, raising a Muslim boy as a Muslim. It's not written there. But if we understand our present situation and see the range of activities that are possible, then we can come up with many remedial actions to cleanse ourselves of defilements and create this positive energy. Okay. Let's take our break now. And if we can make it a little bit less than 10 minutes, that would be good. So if I find a bell, I'll ring it when we should head back. So just to provide a little bit of closure before we move into the main topic, the three activities that promote the development of wisdom, the section A, the first one was engaging in collecting and cleansing practices, for example, the 7 limbs, which is described in B, which I just gave a very thumbnail sketch of. And briefly to mention the other 2. Number 2 is relying on a spiritual friend or teacher, a guru. This also is a very, very vast topic, but but not simply relying on our own intelligence, though of course we have to rely on our intelligence, but not simply that. Turning our mind in the direction of someone that we've cultivated faith in is also a way of gaining great strength in the mind and gaining the inspiration for insight. Mm-hmm. And in relationship to that, for example, I'll give an example. If we wanted to develop compassion, if that's the insight that we wish to develop, of course, then there are various meditations that we could engage in, meditations which identify and help us overcome the self-cherishing attitude, which is the enemy of true compassion, right? So there's these teachings that we could study, but what would be very, very powerful way to proceed, while we're receiving those teachings and doing those meditations, is to receive the inspiration from a teacher who embodied that compassion himself or herself. So, for example, we're fortunate that we share this universe with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's recognized as a human embodiment of the very Buddha of compassion, Chenresik, Avalokiteshvara. So, if we were, just to give us an example, if we were to have received an empowerment or an initiation into the practice of Chenresik, either by His Holiness the Dalai Lama or by one of our other teachers, then we are identifying these enlightened qualities of the Buddha of compassion. We're identifying that with the Guru. And so as we do the meditation on the Buddha of compassion and reciting the 6-syllable mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, this very activity itself serves as a conduit to compassionate energy, for compassionate energy to enter into our heart. So there is the study and the practice of the compassion-related meditations, and then there's activities like simply reciting the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, because for us that mantra represents our Guru and the meditational deity who represents enlightened compassion. So here, now, wisdom is the focus. So relying on a spiritual teacher serves that same purpose of making that living connection with the source of wisdom. And so in this context, we might do the practice of Manjushri. So over there, there's the figure who's wielding the sword, that's Manjushri, who, in the same way that Chenresik is the embodiment of enlightened compassion, then Manjushri is the embodiment of enlightened wisdom. And just as the mantra of Chenresik carries that compassionate energy, the mantra of Manjushri carries that wisdom energy. So again, if we're in a situation where from one of our teachers we receive the empowerment or initiation to do the practices of Manjushri and recite his mantra, then that is a very, very powerful adjunct to our meditation on compassion. Right? When I was studying in India in the early 1970s with Geshe Ngawang Dargay at the Tibetan Library in Dharamsala, we would have meditation sessions, and they lasted about 50 minutes. And of that 50 minutes, about nearly 40 of it were spent in these collecting and cleansing practices and reciting mantras and so forth. And only in the last 10 minutes did we actually focus in meditative practice on the particular subject matter for that session, whether it was the meditation on the wisdom of emptiness or impermanence or precious human rebirth or whatever the topic was. And Geshe Dargay pointed out to us that we were not wasting our time, that those initial practices were setting us up for gaining realizations. So if we set ourselves up by cleansing ourselves of our obstacles and building up the strength of our mind, if we were to do that, then even a few minutes of meditation will bear much more fruit than doing an hour's worth of meditation without having done the collecting and cleansing practices. Okay? So that's, having received that advice directly from my guru like that, I just thought I would like to share it with you. Okay? And then finally, the third factor, the activities that promote the development of wisdom, is the one that we would probably guess. You know, if we had to say, you know, what can we do to develop wisdom? This third one is probably what we would come up with, and that is study the scriptural texts dealing with wisdom. You know, there are teachings by the Buddha, commentaries by the great Indian masters, commentaries by the great Tibetan masters, teachings that we've received that have been passed down for 1,000, 2,000 years, the teachings of our own gurus and so forth. These teachings are all available. So, those teachings on emptiness we study. Right? But what's interesting to me is that it's like, of the activities that promote the development of wisdom, that's only one of three. It isn't just that. Right? Because remember, wisdom, like everything else, to have an effect on us, has to be living. It's not just words in a book. We're not just playing around with concepts. We're trying to make a living connection with a living insight. And so, receiving it through a living source. And not here by living, I don't just mean that the teacher is still breathing. I mean that it's a human being like ourselves who's trained his or her mind in the teachings, and then is not passing on like a parrot or a tape recorder what he or she has just heard, but is speaking from the heart, speaking from experience. Okay? So making that connection in all these various ways with this living tradition is extremely important. Okay? Now, many people here have not met the person they would consider their guru. You know, I'm sure that must be the case for a number of the people in the room. Or even if they've met gurus, they're not sure that this is the one, you know, the root guru. Maybe, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says, up to now teachers have been like professors, you know, giving teachings, and we're just like students. But we haven't really cultivated the guru-disciple relationship. Okay? That's fair enough. So cultivating this respectful mind is a way of coming in contact with such teachers, such really real embodied living guru teachers, spiritual guides. But I wanted to say one thing, and it's a little bit embarrassing for me to get into this topic, so I'll just say a few words and move on. Through circumstances that I don't fully understand, I've been sitting here supposedly giving teachings, right? And many people in this room have been sitting there listening to this guy talk, not just during this module, but other modules and other courses as well. So it may appear that I'm a teacher, and therefore relying on a spiritual friend or teacher is somehow or other relating to me. Okay? The only thing I would say to that is, if anyone has benefited even a molecule's worth of benefit from anything that's coming out of this mouth, it's only because of Lama Thupten Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Geshe Ngawang Dargay and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So if you find a need for relating to a spiritual teacher, there's four. Okay? So, now, to get into the subject matter. Emptiness implies a refutation. Okay? Remember, the root cause of suffering is a misconception. Okay? So, here's the misconception. This lid. Right? That's the misconception. Okay? So the wisdom of emptiness is going to be something that's going to clear away this misconception. It's going to refute it. It's going to eradicate it. Okay? I think in one of the earlier classes I used this term subtractive. You know, the wisdom of emptiness is a subtractive wisdom. We're overcoming a misconception. Okay? So what we're trying to do is find out, well, what's the wrong view? Not because we want to cultivate it, but we don't need to do that. What we want to do is identify where the mistake is so that we can get rid of it. Or, you know, in kind of traditional terms, that we can refute it. Okay? And we can all think of mistaken ideas we have and ways that we could develop a clear insight or a wisdom that would refute that mistaken idea. Like, take an example relating to something I said the other week. If our mistaken idea is all blank people are evil, and fill in the blank with whatever you want, white, black, green, yellow, you know, religious identity, cultural identity, whatever. All this kind of persons are evil. Okay? That's the conception we have. And if we have it very deeply, we don't think of it as a misconception. We think that's an accurate description, right? That's the function of prejudice. It makes us believe those things, those ideas. Okay? So what do we need to do to get rid of that mistaken idea? Well, there's a number of things, but one is simply to become well acquainted with a member of that group. Now, in the beginning, because we're so filled with animosity and fear and prejudice, we see that person as having those characteristics, those bad, negative, evil characteristics. See, I told you. All such people are evil. See, look at that evil expression that's on his face right now. Right? My paranoia proves he's evil. Right? Why would I be so frightened if he wasn't evil? Right? Right? That's the kind of arguments that we engage in, isn't it? You know, if we actually said it and put it into words, it's a comedy routine. It's the fact that we don't say it and put it into words and still believe it that makes it not a comedy routine, but a tragedy routine. Okay? So how do we get out from under that? Is by investigating. You know, not accept the superficial appearance, but really investigating. Then if we come up to the conclusion, well, this guy is really not so bad. You know, he loves his children. You know, he has a job. He donates money to charity. He likes the same baseball team I like. You know, all those kinds of things. Then after a while, we see, well, that idea, that conception I had about him was a misconception. So seeing that it was false means that we're no longer laboring under that force of that prejudice. Right? We've investigated it. We've seen that it's not true. Therefore, the mind believing it evaporates. Right? By refuting the object, the mind that grasps onto the object relaxes its grip automatically. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. So here, in the emptiness meditation, we're trying to identify the object of a misconception. And that's difficult because the object of a misconception is non-existent. Right? So it's very difficult to identify something that's non-existent, especially when you deeply believe from your heart of hearts that it is existent. So it's a difficult task, you know? So, as you might remember from a previous week, when we bring up the topic of I, of self, not this I, you know, not EYE, but the other one, capital I, or self, or, you know, whatever our name is, John, like that. When we start looking at the nature of this I, this self, this John, or whomever we are, one of the things that we discover is that however we refer to it, let me start again. Whenever we refer to this I, we are referring at the same time automatically to an activity that's taking place in the body-mind combination. Or if we want to use specifically Buddhist terminology, the five aggregates. Remember how the five aggregates and the body-mind combination, they're really synonyms. All right? Just one is more analytical approach, that's all. Okay. So, for instance, in one of Lama Zopa's teachings, let me just remind myself. He says, ask yourself, he says, this is emptiness meditation. First ask yourself, he says, how does your I appear to you? And one way of doing that is just to make up a whole series of what you feel to be true statements about I. Right? I did this morning, and then I came here, and then I drove the car, and then I got into an argument, and now I'm sitting here trying to answer this question. Okay? So by doing that, you kind of build up and identify this feeling of I. You know, who's here? I am here. Right? And not just on the level of words, but a feeling of being present, of the I being present. And we should be able to do this because we talk about I all the time, don't we? You know, how many sentences begin with I? How many sentences have me in it? So if we're going to be using I and me all the time, it would be helpful if it referred to something, right? So first we do is to ask a question, all right, what am I doing? Just simply ask that, what am I doing? Doesn't sound like emptiness meditation, does it? But it is. What am I doing? And so we come up with what we think to be a truthful answer to this question, right? I've been sitting here for an hour. He hasn't really approached the topic yet. He keeps saying he's going to talk about it, and I'm getting frustrated. So there's a whole bunch of true statements about the I, right? I feels frustrated. I is physically tired. I is impatient. I is this. I is that. Yeah. Okay. Then, and then also, there's other statements related to that we can make. You know, I'm sitting here, or my back hurts. You know, I feel the pain in my back. You know, or you know, I can't wait till it's over so I can, you know, apply some medical treatment to this. Whatever it is. Okay. So, we cultivate this sense of I being present. Then we identify an activity, a specific activity that we're engaged in. And, you know, what am I doing? And then we answer it. I'm sitting, I'm walking, I'm thinking, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, whatever. Okay. Then Lama Zopa Rinpoche suggests that then we ask ourselves, when we come up with an answer, then we ask ourselves a second question. And the second question is, why can we give that answer? In other words, if the answer to what I'm doing is, let's change the example, I'm walking. Let's say that's the answer of what I'm doing. I'm walking. We're doing a walking meditation, okay? I'm walking, right? So we've asked the question, what am I doing? And we've answered it. So now Lama Zopa Rinpoche suggests we ask a follow-up question. Why can we say, I'm walking? I mean, if that's a true statement, why can we say it? And we don't, let's not be, kind of obvious or glib about it and say, I can say I'm walking because I'm walking. Can't you see I'm walking? Right? That demands further questions. So we have to go further. We have to go further. Don't be satisfied with this superficial thing. That's a tautology, isn't it? Or redundancy of just saying, well, how can you say I'm walking? Well, I can say I'm walking because I'm walking. It doesn't take us any further, does it? Okay? So we really try to answer that. And when we try to answer it, we invariably come up with a statement about something that's going on, and we've gone over this before, right? Something that's going on with the body, or with the mind, or with a combination or a portion of both. All right? So if I'm walking, we say it because the body is engaged with activities which are identified as walking. So, because the body is walking, that's the valid reason for saying, I am walking. Okay? And because my mind is feeling resentful, that's a valid reason for saying, I feel resentful. All right? So whatever statement we come up with, we tie it back to the reason why. Why can we say it? All right? And invariably, but of course we have to check this out for ourselves to see if it's true or not. But according to the investigation that others have done, so we should only take that provisionally until we've done the investigation, but with that caveat, it is because of certain activities taking place in the body and the mind. All right. If that's true, then I, me, my name, is just a name or a label given to those activities. Right? If the reason I can say I am walking is because my body is making certain movements, then I, in that instance, is just a name applied to a bodily activity. Then Rinpoche says, when we give ourselves this answer, when we come to that conclusion, then we can go back and check up. Now, how does the I appear? When we started, we had a feeling that this I was something recognizable. I'm really here. You know? I'm really sitting here. I did all these days' activities. I did this and this and this, got into a car, all this happened, and now here I am in this room, and I'm sitting here. And we have this feeling of really I being present, almost like you could hold it in your hand. There I am. But then, when we say, okay, what's the I doing now? It's sitting. Why can we say it's sitting? Because my body's in this posture. Well, if that's the case, then it seems like I is just a name for referring to a bodily activity. Okay, now you go back and check up. How does that I appear now? Is it seem to be as solid and findable as it did in the beginning? Or does it seem to have somehow lost its sharp defining edge, become a little bit transparent? Okay? This is very powerful meditation. But after a while, it starts to become mere words. It can easily happen. Because we find it difficult to differentiate that basis of imputation from the object imputed on it. And I'll repeat that, and we'll have occasion for repeating that a number of times this course. Okay? These five aggregates, or the body-mind complex, is referred to as the basis of imputation. The basis of imputation. Why is it called that? Because when I say I can only say it because of some activity taking place in the body or mind. So this body-mind combination is the basis upon which I impute or designate or label. These are all synonyms here. Let's switch. Let's call it label. All right? It's upon this activities that I label I, or me, or John. Okay? So it's on that basis that I apply that label. And then, who is that I? That's just what's labeled on that basis. So, we start investigating that for a while, and what happens to the I? It now seems to be nothing more than a name or a label. It doesn't appear that way, does it? You know, when we're not investigating, the I seems to be something very concrete and separate and real, most real. But when we realize that the only time we ever say I is because we're referring to something that's happening in this body-mind combination, then the I starts to look like it's just a name or a label applied to a basis of imputation. Okay? The body-mind complex. We can do that analysis again and again, become kind of very familiar with it, but it may not move our mind very much. Or it may move it, you know, every once in a while it kind of might surprise us and say, oh, I thought I was a lot more solid than that. Now it seems like I'm just a name, right? But of course, there's something within us that kind of rebels against that. You know, who wants to just be a name, you know? What about the real me? Okay, there's a name John, I can write it on, it's written on a birth certificate somewhere, I can write it on an examination paper. But I'm more than just a name. I'm me. I am I, right? We find ourselves kind of stuttering like that, Like with indignation, I must be more than that, my mother loves me. She doesn't love just a name. She loves me, right? So there's this desire to hold on to a very solid, separate sense of self, separate from merely being labeled on a basis. That sounds so dry. Whereas our sense of I is something, vital. Right? So what becomes difficult after a while, and this can settle in at various points in our meditation practice, is that we seem to be engaged in kind of verbal gymnastics, but it's not really getting us anywhere. I'll give you an example that I heard many, many, many years ago. In New Jersey, for reasons that are very, very interesting to relate, but we don't have enough time, there's a Mongolian community. And in that community, there was a great Lama, a Mongolian Lama named Geshe Wangyal. And Geshe Wangyal was kind of like a Zen master. He taught, well, he was capable of teaching in very, very strict, traditional methods, but he also taught by using kind of surprising techniques on many occasions. And so he was teaching his students about emptiness, and they were going over the I being a label on the basis of imputation, and to refute the self-existent I, going all over that. And he had one student who said at one point, I've heard this analysis, I've done it many times myself, he says, but I just don't see the value of it. It's just a whole bunch of words to me, the I being just a label on the basis. So Geshe Wangyal heard that. Now, at the same time that he was giving these teachings, they were also constructing a new home for the center. And it was a very hands-on project. All the students were taking part, and Geshe Wangyal was kind of like the supervisor. So one day, not long after this, he comes along while the same guy, the same student, is working on some lumber, and he looks and he says, "That wood is very expensive, and you just ruined it all. Look what you've done. You've cut it completely wrong. You've messed it up." He said, why you come here and create all this havoc, and cost all this money? And the student, who's been working his tail off, no payment or anything like just out of devotion to the Guru, he's so offended, He says, I've been working nonstop for months on this project, and you come over here and you criticize me for this, and Geshe Wangyal says, there it is. Like that. Because at that moment, I didn't appear to his mind to be just a label onto a basis. Right? This was a very indignant I, a very solid, separate, independent I that was welling up in his heart. And when we identify that and compare it with the basis of imputation, we have something really to work with. Something's going to go on when we do that investigation. It isn't just going to be mere words. But without that, then the confusion, it's difficult to differentiate the object that we're talking about, whether it be the I or whatever it is, and its basis. They start to look like they're the same thing. So there is a meditation that Lama Zopa gave that is a helpful way of understanding why the basis of imputation is not the same as what we're imputing on it. Okay? And he uses an example, but for us to really get into that example, we have to forget what we've learned. Because he uses the example of the letter A. And we all learned about the letter A when we were, just a few years old. So it's hard to remember the time when we didn't know about the letter A. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a letter or a syllable from a language which I'm hoping no one here knows. Is anyone here familiar with the Arabic alphabet, as it's used for Arabic or Persian? Is anyone here who knows that? So that's a fair example. What about the Tibetan alphabet? Some people are a little bit familiar. Okay, I'll just give an example. I don't know if I have to take this microphone with me. Maybe I do. If you can't see this board, it's hard for me to show it simultaneously to everybody. So if you can't see it, maybe just for this part of the demonstration, you might want to move to where you can. Is that okay? Can you see? Yeah. All right. So just watch what I'm drawing here. So what does that look like so far? Backwards J. Anything else? Fish hook. Yeah. At the end of an umbrella. Okay, there's another one. Now what does it look like? Two noses. Two fish hooks. Okay. I'm sorry? An earlobe. Okay. Yeah. All right. Now that you mention it.
Not young ones. Nothing is permanent.
Yeah.
Do something else.
Yeah. And people ask why I'm drawing all these dirty pictures. Okay. So, when kids go to school in Persia, one of the first things that they learn when they're becoming literate is how to write a sentence, and this is the first word in the sentence. And the word is Baba. Baba, and it means father. It's father. This part here with the dot makes the sound B, and this part here makes a ah sound. So this is Baba. Okay? So, how many people here saw Baba? How many people saw me write Baba? You all saw me write Baba? Some people said fishhook, some people said nose, some people said breasts, some people said earlobes. I forget what the other ones were. Okay? Nobody said that I wrote Baba, meaning father. So don't tell me that you saw me write Baba, because no one did. Did anyone? No? I just made a bunch of marks on the paper, and only later did we apply, you had to believe me when I said that in Persian, in Farsi, this serves as a symbol for the sound Baba, which means father. Okay? Now, if we write this several times, and especially if you go up and you write it several times, then when I ask the question, if some time passes and I write this, or you write this on the board, and I ask you, what did I just write? Everyone will say, you just wrote Baba. Okay. But I wrote the same thing the second time that I did the first time. This time, it was fish hooks and earlobes. This time, it was Baba. Okay? Now, this second time, when you identified it as Baba, that's the word that I wrote, was Baba. Okay? Then, where is the Baba? If the Baba was here in the basis, if it was in the basis itself, these lines and dots, then when I wrote it here and had the same basis, that would be Baba. But this wasn't Baba. This wasn't Baba to anybody in the room, except me, right? But this, after a while, was now Baba to everybody. So where is the Baba? Knowledge. Well, don't go as far as wisdom yet.
Our experience.
Label.
Your
Our
experience. Someone said
Label.
the label. In other words, I labeled it Baba, and I did it because Persians for centuries have been labeling it Baba, and I lived there for a while and I learned from them. But the Baba was just the label that was applied to this basis. What was the basis? These curved lines and dots. Okay? So, the object, Baba, and the basis upon which it's imputed, the basis of labeling, are not the same. They're not the same. But imagine if you've been brought up in Iran and years have passed, and you look at this, and Baba seems to be coming from the side of the basis. Where's Baba, you say? And you point there, as if it's existing from its side. It doesn't seem to be a process of labeling anymore. It seems to be a truly independently existing Baba right there. And where's there? We point at the only thing we can point at, the basis. We point at the curvy lines. All right? So the same thing. We point at this body and say John or me or I, as if John or me or I could be found in the body or in the heart or in the mind or anywhere in these five aggregates, anywhere in this body-mind combination. So I seems to be coming from its own side, from the side of the basis. And it seems to be mixed in with the basis as if they were indistinguishable. But in fact, they are distinguishable. Right? And we can use other examples. Like in Tibetan, we can make this kind of boxy shape, like that. And we can put a kind of a curlicue under it. Now, how many people, when I drew that, saw a little boy? But that is the symbol that the Tibetans use for writing the word bu, which means little boy. Okay? So, after a while, when you get familiar with it, when that's written, little boy seems to be existing from this side. The basis of imputation is this kind of boxy shape and this curlicue. The imputation, or the label, is bu, or little boy. Okay? So by doing that, we can see that there's a difference between the basis of imputation and the object imputed on it. Or, to put it another way, between the basis and the label. Now, again, if this isn't connected with an experience, a real experience, basis, label are just words. And after a while, we just become tired of them as we become tired of a commercial jingle on television, right? But the challenge is to really see it as an experience. That when we're saying I, we're relating to it as if it had as if it were coming to us from its own side. It had its own existence, its own character, separate from anything that it might be labeled on. Just as Baba seems to be coming from the side of these letters and little boy seems to be coming from the side of these marks. Okay? But in fact, they're different. They're not the same thing. Okay? Now, is it a mistake to call this Baba or to call this little boy? Is it a mistake? Right. That's the kind of answers that geishas hate. And that we all want to give.
Language, we have to use symbols.
Okay, right. So, for instance, is it wrong for me to say that I've just written cat? No, because I have just written cat. Right? So it's not wrong for me to say that I've written Baba or wrong that I've written Boo, because they are, according to certain conventions. Those what those words are. Okay? But to think that cat is inherent in the basis of these shapes, or that Baba is inherent in these shapes, or that little boy, Boo, is inherent in these shapes, that's a mistake. It's a mistake to think that those names are coming from the side of the basis. The names didn't come from there. The names came from thousands of years of Persian history, many centuries of Tibetan history, and how many centuries of English-speaking history, all created by people like ourselves. And then on the basis of that, we have a recognizable label to apply to certain recognizable basis. So those objects, those words in this case, are all labels applied to basis. And that's all they are. But it doesn't look that way. You know? It seems to be that this is cat. Doesn't just seem to be a label applied to a bunch of shapes. When we're first learning our language, it is. You know, when a kid is writing alphabet for the first time, like the letter A, like he's learning printing, so he or she says, okay, draw a kind of a diagonal line, right? And then draw another diagonal line, okay? And then the kid may play for a while, or if it's dyslexic, it may draw it that way, right? I mean, that's true, you know? Or it might draw it very narrow in the beginning, and then the teacher says, no, it's better if it's a little bit wider. Right? So these are just lines to the child. And then he says, okay, and then add a bar to it, like that. So what has the child seen? The child's seen this line, and this line, and this line put together in a certain shape. Now, because of our education, I would say that everybody in this room, when they look at that, sees the letter A, as if the letter A was coming to us from the side of the paper itself. There was like a self-existent A out there, and everybody in the room saw it. They didn't see me write lines, right, which is the basis of imputation. They saw me write the letter A. But the letter A is just a label imputed on or based on these underlying lines, his basis. And when we're new at it, it's quite obvious that they're different. We have to practice manipulating these lines. We can get them backwards and wrong or upside down or forget what they are. And then when we get it together, we have to be reminded, does that make the sound ah, or does it make the sound e or o, you know? But eventually, when we make that connection, then, when we write this bunch of shapes here, it seems to be A from its own side. Kind of seems permanently, eternally A. How could anybody think it's anything else? Well, if we remember our childhood, we thought it was a whole bunch of other things. you know, right? So we didn't, when we made these marks, we weren't writing A, we were writing lines upon which A, by convention, could be imputed or labeled. And that's how it exists. To think that A is inherent to these lines, that there's something in the base which is inherently A-ness, that it's filled with A-itude, you know, that it has A-ability about it, that's a mistake. Because if it did, every time those letters were put together and we had valid eyesight, we would think A. But that's not true. It only becomes A, that basis only becomes pronounced that way or labeled or said that way when we apply that label to it. But after a while, the basis and the label become indistinguishable. It wasn't that hard for us when we used these unfamiliar shapes, because this didn't seem to have baba-ness to it. This didn't seem to have boo-ness to it, right? But this seemed to have a-ness to it, right? It seemed to. But that baba and the boo and the a didn't exist from the side of the basis. The basis was all it was, a basis, upon which a label was placed. Now, it's not very mind-blowing to use that about letters of an alphabet. But what if we say that I, that we're referring to all the time, in exactly the same way is a merely labeled phenomena? Right? There is a basis, there's an appropriate basis, a body-mind combination, but the I that we're always talking about is nothing more, nothing other, nothing in addition to being a mere label onto that basis. Because it sure as heck doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel that way when we're being praised. It doesn't feel like that when we're being blamed. And in fact, it never feels that way. It's just that sometimes the discrepancy is very dramatic. Okay? And in fact, there's something insulting, in a way, to being said that I is just a label on a base, that I is a merely imputed phenomena, because we have been focusing all our attention to promoting, maintaining this sense of a solid, independently existing I. But that very sense of a solid, independently existing I, according to the teachings of Buddhism, first of all, is non-existent. There is no such thing as an independent I. There's no such thing as an I that exists from its own side. In exactly the same way is that there's no sound baba that's inherent to those shapes, those earlobe shapes. That we know, because no one saw baba in those shapes, until we applied the label and agreed to call it that. Now it's starting to look more and more like baba, isn't it? Okay? Just the same way that those three lines look as if they're A from its own side. Okay? So this sense of, so I, the I that exists, is nothing more than a label applied to a base. Any other conception that we have of I, that there's a real self-existent I coming to us from the side of the object, not from the side of our mind, which is viewing it and applying a label to it, not from that side, but there's something here that's really me from its own side. You know, any thought like that is mistaken. Why is it mistaken? Because it has no true object. The object of it is a fiction. The object, since there is no I that exists from its own side, the belief in it is a misconception. Okay? That's a lot to chew over. That's a lot to chew over. There are a lot of questions, and that's really good. And I'm not going to answer them, which is even better. No, I would really like you to spend a week wrestling with this, chewing on it. You know, do what Lama Zopa suggested. Whenever you feel the presence of I, ask yourself, how's it appearing to me now? And if it's not appearing very strongly, make it appear. You know, listen to yourself talk, repeat it over again, and then ask, what is this I doing right now? What's it doing? Not just a vague idea, a vague logical construct, but it's you. So what are you doing? It's I. What am I doing? Okay? And then come up with an activity which is accurate, which describes something that you're thinking or feeling or moving or acting or something, whatever it is. And then sincerely ask yourself, why can you say that? Then just see what comes up as a result of that. Then, if you've done that a while, then go back and say, now how does the I appear? Is it as distinct, solid, concrete as before? Is it more? You know? It could be more. You know, if it really exists like that, you know, its outline could get sharper, or it could get duller, who knows? But just try to work with that. Just try to work with that. Okay? And then maybe the things that were on the handout, if you look at that, and especially the remarks at the end by Lama Zopa, maybe take those as kind of little bit of hints and so forth of what you're dealing with. But start from experience. You know, we're not just manipulating words here. You know, try to start from our own actual experience. All right? So, in the beginning, we set the motivation. Then we try to apply our mind as concentratedly as we could, considering the person up here speaking has a completely distracted mind. That was probably difficult, but we tried. Okay? So now at the end, some positive energy has been created just by raising a doubt about how the I exists. Okay? I'm not talking about here understanding emptiness, just doubting that maybe the I isn't quite as solid and concrete as I think it is. You know, maybe it is. You know, maybe this is just a smoke and mirrors, but maybe it isn't. You know, maybe there's a basic misconception here. Just that questioning is said to shake the foundations of suffering. Okay? So that's positive. So let us dedicate that positive energy, realizing that there's not an atom of inherent self-existence to be found anywhere in the action of dedicating this positive energy, but nevertheless dedicating it so that all beings may be removed from their mental and physical sufferings. That beings such as Holiness the Dalai Lama, capable of teaching true paths leading to higher rebirth, liberation, and enlightenment, may be endowed with long and fruitful lifetimes, and so that we ourselves can come under the benevolent care of such gurus in all future states of existence, that the Buddhas inhabiting the universe continue to turn the peerless wheel of the Dharma, and so that we ourselves may achieve a state of full spiritual awakening in order to best repay the infinite kindness we've received from each and every being.